Hey everyone, James from the Flying Guillotine YouTube channel here, bringing you another discussion of a director. So another director I've been watching a ton of his films through, and he's just an interesting comparison to Ringo Lam in many ways, is of course everyone's favorite, or perhaps the most famous sort of director coming from Hong Kong to Hollywood during this period, John Woo. So in that same generation of filmmakers as Ringo Lam, coming from Hong Kong during that time, and kind of having a very similar age golden period to Lam, born a decade earlier, so he'd been at it for quite a while longer before he sort of has that golden era period. John Woo, a film director that I started watching basically all his most famous Hong Kong films a long time ago when I was in high school, so about 17, 18 years ago. I did kind of my first John Woo deep dive. Not everything was available then, so I especially did not see a ton of his earlier work, but I was able to even track down Last Hurrah for Chivalry back then, so I did see a number of his films, and a director that, you kind of get those season tickets and you keep tabs on them throughout the years, so watched Paycheck and stuff like that in theaters, and Red Cliff, of course. So just one of those film directors that's always been in my eye. So I've always meant to kind of go back and just rewatch everything and see how I liked it, because I was such a huge fan of especially Hard Boiled and Better Tomorrow and The Killer in high school. And so finally kind of had that chance, and so went back over the past year or so and just started watching all of them. So at this point, I think it's something like 24 or 25 John Woo I've seen. Watched a lot of the earlier stuff too, so kind of wanted to share my tier list as well as just talk about John Woo kind of generally. And he is the most famous, I feel like, of the directors that came here, partially because he was quite successful. A lot of his films did at least get big Hollywood stars and stuff like that. He wasn't stuck working with Jean-Claude Van Damme like Ringo Lam, so he had like real movie stars like Travolta, Nick Cage, Christian Slater in his films. So I think that's part of the reason, and I think another reason is that there's a certain expansiveness to the John Woo films from his golden era that just leaves you feeling, wow. He's not a perfectionist in the same way that I feel like you would talk about David Fincher or like Stanley Kubrick or something like that. But when Woo is hitting his marks, he can create just some incredible set pieces and images that just kind of burn into your memory in ways that like not other filmmakers do. So in some ways, looking at his sort of films during his classic era, I almost put Ringo Lam's just a small touch beneath them. But I think the John Woo films of that period almost like seep an extra layer into your brain more for whatever reason. So personally, I think Ringo Lam is very underrated, but I do think there's a reason why John Woo is kind of like that most celebrated filmmaker. Because you watch some of his films, or you learn a bit about like the production history of Hard Boiled, where they're kind of making stuff up on the fly and stuff like that, and they're just like a day or two ahead, and stuff is not like storyboarded for 4 years or whatever coming in. So I think I think it's just the man has an incredible gift to craft these images and stuff like that. And I think early on in his career, pre A Better Tomorrow, it's interesting to see a lot of his films because you see glimpses of that, but it's so much reduced compared to what it becomes in sort of his golden Hong Kong era. And then Hollywood, I feel like he almost sometimes gets away with a little bit too much in some of his films. Although I suppose that could be debated and stuff like that. Because John Woo, to me at least, a lot of his tropes can come across as quite goofy at times. Stuff like the white birds and stuff flying through, and just the very, very heightened emotions and melodrama. For me, that stuff works great in his golden era, and it works kind of some of the time in his Hollywood films. So it kind of depends on the movie, and I can't say I'm the biggest fan of his post-Hollywood films either. So for me, kind of a mixed bag there, but definitely in that golden period, I think it's absolutely 100% worth celebrating. But yeah, it's just like we think about some like the slow motion or images. He's just such a distinctive director. Like you could show a series of images from a number of his films and you'd be like, okay, that is John Woo. I was listening to the Heroes 3 podcast before this, talking about A Better Tomorrow, and they talk a lot. I'm personally not an anime guy, but I know a lot of people are, and they talk about how a lot of his images and stuff like that feel like they were the influence on a lot of anime, and I totally see it. The man crafts incredible visual images, and I think he had this perfect sort of star in that period in Chow Yun-fat too. All right, so for me, I kind of put Woo films into, I guess, 4 categories. The first one would be pre A Better Tomorrow, and A Better Tomorrow was actually his 16th film, which is kind of crazy. And you just think about if he had chosen to hang up his director spurs before then, if we would have no John Woo, or at least John Woo would be considered an extremely minor filmmaker, which I think he would be if he didn't kind of continue on to direct all of these good films in like the late 80s and the 90s. So that first era, a lot of martial arts films, not entirely martial arts, but a lot of different stuff. Here's where I watched a lot of the newer stuff to me. I had already seen Last Hurrah for Chivalry, but that was the only one. So watched some of his early collaborations with Jackie Chan, as well as one of his comedies as well, To Hell with the Devil. Then his second era, I think, kind of kicks off with Hero Shed No Tears / A Better Tomorrow, both 1986. Really, A Better Tomorrow, I think, is what ushered in this era, which won the first, I think, Hong Kong Film Award for Best Picture. So immensely celebrated film at the time. And I think it's kind of just like a confluence of things coming together in order to make something really wonderful. I think Woo obviously had a lot of skills at that point, but being put in a place where he's casting Chow Yun-fat, who was probably thought of as the third star at that time behind T. Lung and Leslie Chung, as well as just kind of the right genre for him. I think he is just very, very specifically well suited toward these like action thrillers and stuff like that. And it's like if you see his early martial arts films, some of them are fine and some of them are even good, but it does not feel as like distinctive as that. So I just feel like sometimes you just need the right match to occur. And I think for Woo, this is the period where he really found that. And then after that, Hard Boiled kind of concludes that just golden age era, goes to Hollywood and makes a number of action films there. I don't think anyone could make the case that this period was better than the golden era, but he certainly made a couple great films during that period. I'll talk about what my personal favorites are there. And then the post-Hollywood career, which to this point is pretty much Red Cliff, The Crossing, and Manhunt. So kind of a mixed bag there. Getting older in age now, he's 75. I believe he is directing a film in Mexico there. So for me, there are 3 classics in there, 6 great films, 6 good ones, 4 okay ones, and 5 that I would say meh too. Another interesting thing I just wanted to share before I kind of get into the list is that he also has directed a surprisingly number of films set during war. There's The Crossing 1 and 2, Red Cliff 1 and 2, Bold in the Head, Windtalkers, and Heroes Shed No Tears. So if you count Crossing and Red Cliff as 2 movies each, that's 7 films. So that's quite a few films for a... there's not too many directors that specialize in just war films. So it's interesting because I don't think Woo is usually associated with that sort of genre. So it's interesting to think that he has done quite a few films in there, and a couple very, very good films in there. All right, so let's get on to the list. All right, so lowest tier, tier D as I'm calling it. To Hell with the Devil, Mission Impossible 2, The Crossing 1 and 2, and Dragon Tamer. So 5 films there. Crossing 1 and 2, for me, the melodrama with Woo is hit or miss. For me here, it's a miss. And these films are a lot of melodrama. And by the time that the big set pieces, which are pretty well directed, come around, I'm just not engaged. I think The Dragon Tamers, which is an early Woo, and seems to be kind of a Golden Harvest production trying to sort of take advantage of the big film of that era, Hapkido, so set in Korea. It has some really good action. I don't think the story works at all, and I think the film in general is kind of a mess. So, and it's long. It's long for that period. I think it's around 110 minutes. So for me, this is definitely a miss. I just was very much checked out by the time even halfway of the film goes around. There are some good fights though, so you can do see a bit of promise there. But just not a very visually arresting film either. So I feel like this is the film where I was left scratching my head the most and like, wow, John Woo directed this film, this incredibly mediocre film. To Hell with the Devil, I know some people like this film. For me, at least, the comedy in here just doesn't totally work. And the Hong Kong comedy can just be hit or miss for different people. For me, it's a miss here. Mission Impossible 2, I actually kind of feel similar to Dragon Tamers here. Has some very nice Woo imagery, but you just have to wait a very long time to get it. And for me, I do tend to check out of this one. I rewatched it recently, hoping to kind of reevaluate and enjoy it. But for me, it's easily his worst American film during that time. Okay, so tier C. So these films are okay. I think some of these have some nice stuff going on, and I find them to be fairly tolerable, but I think I would hesitate to even call any of these good. So I have Paycheck, Hand of Death, Young Dragons, and Blackjack. So 4 films, Hand of Death, Young Dragons, early Woo. I think both of these pair him with Jackie Chan. So working with some incredibly talented entertainers. I think one thing that's interesting is like you look at his early films, and we know he was an assistant director for Chong Che on a couple films, I think, but notably Boxer from Shantung, which is a really good Chong Che film from 1972. Incredibly violent conclusion to it, and Chong Che has incredible use of slow motion in a lot of his movies, and I think we can kind of look to that to see where John Woo starts to get this. And it's interesting to see him use slow motion in these early films. And I think in many ways, it is a very similar way that he is using the slow motion to the way that Chong Che does, where he'll linger on characters' death and suffering and cruelty. And I think Woo does that too. And in many ways, I think a couple of these films at those points, at their most memorable points, almost feel like a sort of mediocre Chong Che ripoff. It's also just interesting to think of those characters too. Chong Che directed a good number of violent films, but I do find that his best work is tonally quite different from Woo's. Woo, I think, really heightens up that melodrama. Both of them focus a lot on films about men and brotherhood and stuff like that. And there's something about Woo and the way he constructs images that doesn't make it feel quite so heavy and downbeat as Chong Che films. Chong Che, one of my favorite filmmakers too. But I feel like there is a level of darkness and cynicism that kind of seeps throughout a lot of his films throughout his career, just with like a lot of blood being shed, oftentimes heroes and people like that dying. Whereas Woo, there is an incredible amount of cruelty, but it comes across tonally quite differently. So anyways, a bit of a tangent there. Blackjack, a really odd Dolph Lundgren TV film. Pretty good at points. There were definitely some moments I was like, this is not bad, but I think for the most part it doesn't come together. Part of it is because I don't think Dolph Lundgren's an incredibly strong actor, but it's got some good action to it. Not a bad film. I enjoyed probably most of it. And Paycheck, just kind of a weird sci-fi Ben Affleck. Action is probably weaker than most for John Woo's. Doesn't totally work, but, you know, there are worse ways to pass the time. Okay, now on to the good. So for me, this is Hard Target, Broken Arrow, Manhunt, Red Cliff, Once a Thief, and Just Heroes. Red Cliff, I think some people might put it a little higher. War movies, not really my thing. Some really strong images in here. I like this much, much more than The Crossing. I rewatched this, and it went up quite a bit in my rankings. I think seeing it in the context of Woo and seeing some like the slow motion and stuff like that, that can sort of seem a little bit silly in a vacuum. I think it works much better once you do look at this more, once you're in more of those rhythms of Woo and just the way that he crafts images and stuff like that. So I enjoyed it a fair amount. Not my favorite Woo by any stretch of the imagination, but solid. And I think it's a good film, and we might look at this as one of his last pretty good films. Manhunt, very much a John Woo film. I feel like this one, more than most, feels a little goofy at times. But again, so I think if you approach this film in a vacuum, maybe not the most enjoyable, but looking at it as sort of like a very John Woo, just unleashed and going wild and doing all of his crazy tropes that he does. It's fine. I enjoy it. And some very, very solid action, as you can expect, and some great use of slow motion. Once a Thief and Just Heroes, so two films in kind of his golden era. Once a Thief, really light, airy, easy to watch, easy to digest. Not the most memorable. Just Heroes as well, just kind of a solid film in that era. Not the most memorable either. Hard Target and Broken Arrow, I think, have moments of being quite good, and then they suffer from just a little bit of unevenness. I wonder if Wu fought with studios during this time, because dramatically, I think these films work okay, not great, but yeah. So solid all around. Again, I'm not a huge Van Damme fan, so maybe that impacts my rating of Hard Target. And then Tier A. Okay, so here we are getting into kind of the core Wu. So from his early period, I have Last Hurrah for Chivalry, which I think is definitely his best martial arts film, his best early film, and the one that kind of shows the most promise and the most of what would come. And it is the closest to what would kind of his heroic bloodshed films look like if they were set in more of that old wuxia martial arts setting. Very good film. Some strong images to it and some good slow motion as well. Good fighting. I liked this film when I watched it in high school. I watched it in the last few months. I still like it a fair amount, and I think the film gets better and better as it goes on. And it probably represents sort of the height of what Wu could do if he continued to work in this genre. Heroes Shed No Tears, a good, solid war film from him. A Better Tomorrow, I think, is kind of a mess, but A Better Tomorrow 2, that is, but doesn't totally work. And then from his American period, I have Face Off and the Windtalkers here. Face Off, I think, is kind of a goofy film, a little uneven in the way that a lot of his American films are, but is very strong, really good performances from Cage and Travolta. Windtalkers, I think, is probably his most underrated American film. I think it's really quite good. And I wish I could take credit for this, but I saw someone sort of talking about how all the World War II films after Saving Private Ryan kind of suffer from being compared to that film as far as like sort of seriousness. And Windtalkers, it isn't really in the Saving Private Ryan mode. It's far more of a John Woo film. And I think it's a really good one, actually. So I think really, really underrated. Strong Cage performance. Good performance by the second lead to the Native American actor. Sorry, I'm forgetting his name. And then the last film I have in here is probably going to be the most controversial, The Killer, which I just don't quite like as much as The Very Best Wu. Yeah, I think it's a really good film. I've always enjoyed the film, but for me it doesn't quite reach the same heights as my absolute 3 favorite John Woo films go. And part of that might be because I'm just not quite as much of a melodrama guy, and the melodrama here is maybe played up to the most that John Woo plays it up. Nevertheless, very good film, strong performances from Diane Lee, Chow Yun-fat, absolutely iconic film. Yeah, and that brings me to Tier S, so the top tier that I have here, where I have A Better Tomorrow, Hard Boiled, and Bold in the Head. Bold in the Head is probably my favorite, and that film just is one of those that just leaves such a strong impact, and I think it tends to be underrated a bit just because it's mentioned usually after The Hard Boiled, The Killer, and A Better Tomorrow. I think it's just as strong a film as all of those, and just seeing, I don't know, it's just a really, really good film, obviously influenced by some of the Vietnam films from America, and just really, really banger film, and absolutely packs a punch, some really strong images, and it's just everything you would want from a John Woo film. It's crazy to think that he just directed something like 8 films within like 7 years, and like so many of them are really, really good. Yeah, Hard Boiled, nothing needs to be said about this. Absolutely one of my favorites. Definitely one of the favorite films when I was in high school, just sort of seeing it then. It's interesting that these Woo films have continued to be sort of unavailable to some extent. You can find these films on YouTube, but they really haven't gotten the proper releases that they deserve. and A Better Tomorrow, which is just all-time classic. I think it holds up great today. I was really pleased on my rewatch here. It's also interesting to sort of look at it as sort of like Chained to the Guard, having gotten a lot more familiar with Hong Kong cinema over the years, seeing T. Lung as sort of like the old guard, the old Shaw Brothers star. Here he's starting to lose even more of his hair and just sort of pass the baton. I think originally they thought it would be more passed to Leslie Chung, the big canto pop star, but instead it kind of goes inadvertently to Chow Yun-fat and really helped to define kind of the next 6 or 7 years of John Woo's career. Yeah, so that is it for this episode. Let me know how you liked it. Let me know how your John Woo rankings go and what you would put into your top tier. What are your top 3? What's your top 4? Yeah, so thank you all for tuning in. Hit that thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, and as well as subscribe. I will see you all next time.